He didn't hesitate. The order was clear. He had done this before, but this time, something made him stop. Jesus saves the life of an innocent man from the hands of an angry soldier. What if I told you that a single word from Jesus changed a man's destiny forever? At the last second, when death seemed inevitable, a miracle happened, but not an ordinary miracle. Imagine the scene. A Roman soldier, his hand firmly on his sword, ready to carry out an order. The cold look, trained not to feel remorse. Before him, an innocent man kneeled, resigned to his fate, without the strength to fight. The silence. A round is piercing, the weight of the execution hangs in the air. Everyone just waits for one move. But just as the blade is about to descend, something makes him hesitate. A look, a voice, an invisible power that transforms everything. What could make a hardened warrior stop an act he had already repeated so many times? What made this soldier stop? Could it be fear? Could it be fault? Or was something much bigger at work? This is not just a story of life and death. It's a story about destiny, about redemption, about the moment when a simple encounter changes everything. What if I told you that this story could have been erased from humanity's memory? That few people actually know what happened there? Today, you will discover the truth. Throughout history, Jesus intervened countless times in moments of injustice. But this story is different. Because here, Jesus didn't just stop a crime. He touched the heart of a man who never imagined being transformed. What did Jesus say? What did he do? How could a simple presence break the coldness of a soldier trained to obey without question? Stories like this are rare, almost forgotten. But today you have the chance to learn about something that can transform the way you see Jesus, and even your own life. This story came to you because in some way it needs to be heard. So leave your like, because every detail of this narrative was made to touch your heart. And I want to know, have you ever lived through a moment when everything changed in an instant? Something that seemed to be written, but at the last second took a completely different turn. Tell me here in the comments, because I read each one and this exchange makes all the difference. And sign up now, because this is the only place where you will find stories about Jesus that few people know about. The next one could be even more impactful, and I guarantee it. Losing would be missing something that could change everything. Now take a deep breath. What comes next will make you see this moment in a way you never imagined. The sun beat down on the dusty streets of Jerusalem, reflecting its intense glare on the shining armor of the Roman soldiers. The smell of iron and sweat permeated the air, mixed with the subdued murmur of a crowd that squeezed between the narrow alleys. People's eyes carried fear, uncertainty, and a silent dose of revolt. Rome ruled with an iron fist, imposing its authority over a people who, although submissive in appearance, nourished the desire for liberation in their hearts. Oppression was felt on every corner, in unfair tax collections, in public executions that served as a warning, and in the constant presence of armed soldiers, ready to crush any sign of rebellion. The Roman Empire dominated not only with brute force, but also with a policy of fear and absolute control. Every village, every market, and every temple was under surveillance, and anyone who defied the imposed order could be taken away without explanation, convicted in sham trials, and sentenced to death without any chance of defense. Crucifixions were common. For the Romans, they were more than a punishment. They were a horror show, a way to remind the people who was in charge. Roman soldiers were the embodiment of this domination. Trained from a young age to be war machines, they were disciplined, lethal, and ruthless. For them, the act of taking a life carried no moral weight, only duty and obedience. Anyone who hesitated would be seen as weak. Anyone who questioned would be punished mercilessly. Among these soldiers was a man whose story was about to change. A man who, until that moment, believed his only purpose was to obey without question. The noise of heavy sandals echoed on the stone floor, mixed with the clanking of swords in their scabbards and the crack of whips that ripped through the air. The soldier marched with firm steps, following the order he had received without hesitation. Before him, an innocent man was about to be condemned. He was no ordinary criminal. He was not a thief nor a rebel. He was just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time, hunted by those who feared the truth. The crowd whispered. Some looked away, unable to bear the scene. Others, more hardened by the brutality of everyday life, watched with resignation. For many, this was just another day under Rome's rule. One more execution among many, another life being erased before it even had the chance to be heard. But something was different that day. There was a strange energy in the air, something that no one could explain, but that was felt deep in the soul. An unusual silence fell between the people, as if time itself had slowed down, as if destiny was about to take an unexpected turn. The soldier took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the blade in his hand. The cold steel felt even colder under the scorching sun. His mission was clear, and he was not one to question orders. But for some reason, at that moment, something inside him faltered. For a brief instant, the scene before his eyes seemed different. The face of the man kneeling in front of him carried neither despair nor anger. There was something there, something the soldier couldn't decipher. And then, at the last second, before the blade cut through the air towards the innocent, a voice echoed, a firm, serene voice, but filled with indescribable power. It was as if each word had the weight of the universe itself, piercing not just the ears, but the soul of whoever heard it. And it was at that moment that everything changed. The soldier felt a shiver run down his spine. The cold blade of the sword, which had so often become an extension of his arm, now felt heavier than ever. Sweat dripped down his forehead, mixing with the suffocating heat of the city. His name was Marco Julio Cassio, an experienced centurion forged in battles and hardened by the brutality of military life. He was not a cruel man, nor was he a bloodthirsty killer, but he was a soldier, and soldiers obeyed. His loyalty belonged to Rome, and his duty was to maintain order at any cost. Questions were not welcome, and hesitation was seen as weakness. From a young age, Marco had learned that the world belonged to the strong. He grew up on the unforgiving streets of Rome, the son of a blacksmith who forged weapons for the legions. His father, a man of few words and tough gestures, had taught him that surviving meant hardening his heart. The boy, who had once felt fear, became a cold and disciplined young man, ready to serve the empire without question. At the age of 17, he joined the legion. At 20, he had already shed blood in the name of Caesar. Wars, rebellions, executions. Death had become a common scenario, an element present in every step of his life. He had killed before, often. He saw the glow of life disappear from the eyes of countless enemies, felt the weight of bodies falling around him, heard the last breaths of men begging for mercy. But for him, mercy was a luxury reserved for victors. Wasting time pondering the fate of a convict was not part of his training. A soldier didn't question, he just carried out his mission. But something inside him began to change when he was sent to the province of Judea. That was different territory. There, the Romans not only fought armed rebels, but dealt with a people who resisted in unexpected ways. They didn't fight with swords, they fought with faith. There was something about the Jews that Marco had never fully understood. They did not fear Rome like other conquered peoples. There was a flame in them, something unbreakable that neither floggings nor crucifixions nor oppression were able to extinguish. Among the soldiers, there was a rumor that a different man walked that land. A Jew without an army, without riches, without political position, but who attracted crowds as if he were a king. They said that his words had power, that his hands healed, that his eyes saw beyond. The flesh reaching directly to the soul. Many soldiers laughed at these stories, dismissing them as myths of a superstitious people. But Marco was an observant man. He noticed the looks of fear that his companions in uniform tried to hide. He saw how even Roman officials spoke of this man with some hesitation. He wasn't just another preacher. He was different. Now there was Marco in front of a condemned man about to serve another sentence. But something wasn't right. There was something in the countenance of that man kneeling before him, something that defied all logic he knew. The condemned man did not tremble. He didn't beg for his life. His gaze carried neither fear nor despair. On the contrary, he seemed at peace, as if he knew something that Marco didn't know, as if he saw beyond that moment. The soldier tightened his fingers around the hilt of his sword. A strange cold spread across his chest, as if the blade he held was turned against himself. He felt his breathing become heavy. It was a feeling he had never experienced before. He, a man accustomed to war, felt for the first time doubt. Why did that execution feel different from all the others? Why didn't that man react like all the other convicts? Then Marco looked around. The faces in the crowd were a reflection of mixed feelings. Some had their usual expression, a mix of morbid curiosity and resigned acceptance. But others seemed to feel the same strangeness as he did. Whispers grew among the people. Something was about to happen. He felt it in every part of his being, and it was at that moment, at the exact moment the blade began to descend, that a voice was raised in the middle of the crowd. A calm voice, but filled with an authority that no emperor, no general, no king had ever possessed. Time seemed to stop. The voice cut through the silence like invisible thunder, and when Marco turned to see where she was coming from, his eyes met something he would never forget, something that would change his life forever. The condemned man was kneeling on the dust-covered ground, his knees bruised by the impact of the uneven stones of the street. His hands were tied behind his back with a rough rope, tight enough to cut off circulation, but not tight enough to elicit any sign of distress from him. His look was not one of despair. It wasn't out of fear. He didn't tremble. He didn't struggle. He didn't cry out for mercy, like so many others who had gone through that same situation. Before, there was an unsettling tranquility in his eyes, a peace that defied everything one expected of a man about to die. Marco had already executed dozens of men throughout his career, rebels, thieves, traitors, murderers. They all shared a common characteristic. In the final moment, fear consumed them. Some screamed, pleaded, swore their innocence. Others rebelled, cursed their tormentors, tried to free themselves in a last act of desperation. But that man was different. His name was Ephraim, a Jew born in Jerusalem, known among the city's merchants. A simple man who worked in the market stalls since he was little, helping his father sell fabrics brought from distant lands in the east. He was never involved in political disputes, never led rebellions, never took up arms against Rome. So why was he there, kneeling, waiting for the execution blade? The answer was as absurd as it was revolting. Ephraim had been condemned for something he did not do, a trumped-up accusation, a dirty plan devised by those who didn't want to get their own hands dirty. He was not a criminal. He had not committed murder, robbery, or treason against the empire. His only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Witnesses said that Ephraim had secretly met with a group of followers of that man who preached a new message, one who spoke of love, of forgiveness, of a kingdom that was not of this world. It was not known for certain whether he was part of the disciples or whether he simply sympathized with the cause. The fact is that for the enemies of this new doctrine, this was enough to seal their fate. The city's religious leaders were restless. The Nazarenes' words were gaining too much force, attracting crowds who began to question the authority of their teachers. They needed an example. They needed to show that anyone who challenged the established order would face severe consequences. But arresting Jesus for no reason could cause outrage. The city was already in constant tension with Roman rule, and one mistake could trigger an uprising. So they found an easy target in Ephraim. They caught him in an alley as he was returning home after a day of work. They said that he was conspiring against Rome, that he was plotting with the followers of the Nazarene to sow discord among the Jews and incite the people against Caesar. An absurd accusation, without evidence, without reliable witnesses, without a fair trial. But Rome didn't need proof. One accusation of treason was enough, and the sentence was given. Marco, as a soldier, did not question these decisions. He just carried out the orders he received. He knew that many of the men he had killed could have been innocent. He knew that power was often used to satisfy personal interests, but he never cared, never hesitated. He never doubted the importance of his role. But now, standing in front of this man, something inside him told him something was wrong. Ephraim's eyes were fixed on him, not with hate, not with fear, not with despair, only with understanding, as if he knew what Marco was feeling, as if he understood the doubt that was beginning to form within the soldier. The sword blade shined under the scorching sun. Sweat ran down Marco's face. The voices around him seemed distant, muffled by the whirlwind of thoughts that were beginning to dominate his mind. But he could not hesitate. He was a soldier of Rome, and Rome demanded blood. Then, before he could allow himself to feel anything, he raised his sword and prepared to carry out his mission. It was at that exact moment that a new presence appeared in the crowd, a presence that changed everything. A man advanced among the onlookers watching the scene, without haste, without fear. His face was serene, his eyes were intense, and when his voice echoed through the space, every sound around him fell silent. And it was at that moment, with the blade still suspended in the air, that Marco heard, for the first time. Have you ever felt like you were about to make a decision and something bigger intervened? Have you ever had the feeling that your life could have gone another way, if not for a single moment? Write here in the comments what that moment was. I really want to know your story. I'm sure this story is for you, so leave a like, because stories like this need to reach more people. And to continue discovering stories that few people know about, subscribe to the channel, because what comes next will surprise you even more. The sun burned brightly in the Jerusalem sky, casting distorted shadows across the uneven stone floor. The heat made the air shiver slightly, and sweat ran down Marco's face, mixing with the fine dust that danced in the wind. The screams and murmurs that had previously echoed among the crowd disappeared, replaced by a dense, almost palpable silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. Everyone was waiting for the inevitable moment. Ephraim, kneeling on the rough ground, felt the ropes tighten around his wrists. The thick fiber cut into his skin, leaving deep marks, but he showed no pain. His body was firm, his gaze fixed on a distant point, as if his mind no longer belonged there. His face, covered in sweat and dust, did not show revolt or despair, just acceptance. His lips moved slowly, forming words that no one but him could hear. Maybe a prayer, maybe goodbye. The crowd squeezed around the scene. Men, women, children. Some looked away, unable to face what was about to happen. Others watched with a strange mix of fascination and horror. It was like this in all executions. The public gathered to witness death as if it were an inevitable spectacle, a play repeated so many times that it no longer caused astonishment. But that afternoon, something felt different. There was a strange tension in the air, an invisible weight that made even the silence suffocating. Marco's companions, experienced soldiers accustomed to brutality, were alert, but there was something in their eyes that the centurion recognized, a disguised discomfort. They knew this was not justice. They knew that the man kneeling there was not a criminal, but it wasn't their place to judge. Rome gave the orders. Rome decided who lived and who died. Marco gripped the hilt of his sword, feeling the familiarity of the cold metal against his palm. He had done this before, countless times. Each execution was just another trained movement, a mechanical act, part of his function. But at that moment, something inside him refused to obey. He inhaled deeply, feeling the warm air fill his lungs. The weight of the armor pressed down on his body, each piece of metal symbolizing the burden of his position. He was a soldier. He was trained not to feel, not to question. The blade rose slowly, reflecting the sunlight in a sharp glare. The moment had arrived. Ephraim closed his eyes. There was no screaming. There was no pleading, just absolute silence, as if he had already accepted his fate. Marco tensed his muscles. His fingers tightened on the grip. He braced himself for the final blow, but the instant the blade began to descend, something stopped him. A voice. Not just any voice. Not a cry of despair from the crowd, not a command from his superior. It was a firm, deep voice, filled with an authority he had never heard before. A voice that not only passed through space, but seemed to touch something within it. Marco froze. His breathing caught. His hand shook slightly, and his eyes searched for the source of that sound. It was then that he saw him. The crowd parted around a man who was slowly approaching. He didn't wear armor. He didn't carry weapons. He didn't have the posture of a warrior. But his presence was imposing. He walked with impressive serenity, as if the brutal scene in front of him didn't shake him, as if he already knew exactly what would happen before he even arrived. Marco's eyes met his. For a brief moment, it was as if everything else had disappeared. There was no crowd. There was no suffocating heat. There was no order he had received, nor the weight of the sword in his hand. There was just that look. That man's eyes were unlike anything Marco had ever seen. They carried no fear, no anger, no judgment. They were deep, intense, as if they saw beyond the flesh, beyond appearances, as if they saw every part of who he was, every mistake he ever made, every doubt, every invisible scar that the war had left inside him. The sword remained suspended, the edge of the blade a few centimeters from Ephraim's neck. The crowd was still holding its breath, but Marco couldn't move. It was as if his body no longer belonged to him, as if something beyond his own will was stopping the blow. The voice echoed again, firm but without aggression. You have the power to decide between life and death, but choose wisely. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that Marco couldn't ignore. It was as if time had stopped, as if his mind was being pulled to a place he had never dared to explore. What was happening? Who was this man? Why did her presence affect him this way? He tried to ignore it. He tried to force his muscles to obey, to complete the blow he had started. But something stopped him. Something inside him screamed that he couldn't go any further. Murmurs began to grow among the crowd. People began to look at each other, some with astonishment, others with indignation. What was happening? Why didn't the soldier finish his task? His companions watched carefully. Some seemed uneasy, others hid their surprise with impassive expressions. But Marco knew everyone was waiting. He needed to decide, and in that moment, for the first time in years, he felt afraid. But not the fear he knew from battles, not the fear of death or defeat. It was a different fear, a fear that came from within, as if something was crumbling inside him, something he had spent his entire life trying to keep intact. He couldn't explain it. I didn't know what to do. All he knew was that the man standing in front of him had something he had never seen in anyone else, something that made him question everything he believed. And it was at that moment that Marco realized that his life would never be the same. Now tell me, have you ever felt like something bigger intervened in your life when everything seemed lost? Write here in the comments what that moment was. I really want to know your story. This story of Jesus has already captivated you so far. So leave a like, because stories like this need to reach more people. And if you want to continue discovering stories that few people know about, subscribe to the channel, because what comes next will surprise you even more. Time seemed to have stopped. Marco still held his sword upright, the blade shaking slightly in his hands. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with the fine dust that the hot wind raised. Every fiber of his body told him to complete the blow, to finish what? He started, not to hesitate, not to appear weak, but he couldn't. Something invisible weighed on him, something he had never felt before. The murmur of the crowd grew all around. People looked at each other, confused, some indignant, others scared. They had never seen a soldier hesitate. They had never seen a man in the legion tremble before an execution. Among the other soldiers, the discomfort was visible. Some held their swords tighter, ready to intervene if necessary. Others just watched, waiting to understand what was happening. But no one knew how to explain it. No one understood why Marco didn't finish what should have been a quick and accurate strike. And then, in the crowd, something changed. People began to move away slightly, as if an invisible presence was making space between them. There was no pushing, no shouting, just a natural, almost unconscious movement, as if everyone there felt they needed to get out of the way. And then he appeared. Jesus walked slowly, his bare feet gently touching the dust of the road. His simple robe swayed slightly in the warm breeze. The sun drew soft shadows over his face, highlighting his serene features. He didn't seem anxious. There was no hurry in his steps. There was no hesitation in his gaze. There was just an absolute certainty, a presence that was impossible to ignore. Marco noticed his approach before he even looked up. He felt it before he saw it. It was as if the very air around him had transformed, as if an invisible force had taken over the space. His heart sped up, his chest tightened, and when he finally looked up, his eyes met Jesus's. It was as if time really stopped. Jesus didn't say anything right away. He just looked at Marco, and that look went through every barrier the soldier had erected throughout his life. There was no trial, there was no anger, there was no fear, just an absolute truth, a deep understanding, a knowledge that went beyond words. It was a look that saw everything. Marco felt his breathing hitch. The sword in his hand, which had previously felt like an extension of his own body, now weighed as if it were made of lead. His fingers tightened on the handle, as if his mind was still trying to hold on to what he always believed. He was a soldier. He served Rome. He obeyed orders. Wasn't that your purpose? Wasn't that what defined him? But at that moment, none of that seemed to matter. Jesus took another step forward. His shadow fell over Ephraim, who was still kneeling on the ground. The condemned man raised his head, his eyes meeting Jesus's, and there, even with his hands tied and his body weak, there was an expression of relief, as if he knew he was safe before anything was said. Finally, Jesus spoke. You have the power to decide between life and death, but choose wisely. The voice was firm, but without aggression. She was serene, but charged with an authority that did not come from force, but from something much greater. Marco felt each word resonate within him, as if they had been spoken directly to his soul. He blinked rapidly, trying to organize his thoughts. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to defy a Roman execution. I had heard pleas, I had heard protests, but this was different. Jesus was not begging. I wasn't trying to argue. He was simply there, as if he was sure that his presence was enough to change everything. Marco swallowed hard. Every part of his training screamed at him to ignore it, so that he could finish what he started. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what to do. He looked at Ephraim. The condemned man remained kneeling, his eyes now fixed on the ground, as if he were waiting for a miracle. He looked at the other soldiers. Some had tense expressions, others just seemed curious. None of them would do anything without direct orders. He looked at the crowd. The silence was absolute now. Every person there waited. I watched. And then he looked at Jesus again. Jesus was still staring at it, his expression unchanged. But there was something there, something Marco couldn't ignore, something that said that if he put down his sword now, his life would never be the same. His arms started to shake. The weight of the sword was unbearable. What should he do? What would happen if you challenged Rome? But what would happen if he ignored that moment? Breathing became heavier. His fingers began to relax on the hilt of the sword. A chill crept up his spine. And then, in a last-ditch effort to maintain control, Marco did the only thing he could still do. He waited. Have you ever experienced a moment when you had to make a decision that would change everything? Have you ever felt like you were facing something bigger than yourself? Write here in the comments what that moment was. I really want to know your story. I'm sure this story's touching your heart, so leave a like, because stories like this need to reach more people, and to continue discovering stories that few know about. Subscribe to the channel, because what comes next will touch you even more. The weight of the sword was unbearable. Marco still held the blade up, but his fingers no longer had the same grip. A cold sweat ran down the back of his neck, and his breathing was heavy, as if the air around him had become too thick to be absorbed. He had never felt anything like this before. The fear of death was something he knew well, but this was different. It wasn't fear of an enemy. It wasn't doubt about one's own strength. It was something internal, a battle fought within himself, a confrontation between everything he had learned and something new, something he couldn't understand. Jesus was still there, standing in front of him, no rush, no urgency. His gaze remained fixed, and Marco couldn't look away. Those eyes carried something the soldier had never seen before. It wasn't the look of a rebel trying to resist. It wasn't the look of a convict begging for mercy. It wasn't even the look of someone hoping for justice. It was a look that said that he already knew the outcome of everything, that he already knew every detail of what was happening there, that he saw something far beyond the scene that was unfolding at that moment. Time seemed frozen. Marco blinked a few times, trying to regain focus. He needed to complete the execution. That's what he always did. It was what Rome expected of him. But for some reason, his body didn't obey. The blade, which he had cut without hesitation so many times, now trembled in his hands. His muscles were locked, and his heart was pounding, as if an invisible force was stopping him from continuing. Jesus did not look away. His eyes held no fear, no anger, no disapproval, just something Marco had never received from anyone: understanding. It was as if he saw inside him, as if he knew every step that brought him there, every invisible wound, every suffocated doubt, every moment of loneliness that a soldier's life imposed. Marco didn't want to feel that way. He didn't want to allow that presence to break down the walls he had built over the years. But it was too late. The noise of the crowd became distant. He knew they were whispering, knew they were all waiting for his next action. The other soldiers looked on with tense expressions. None of them dared to interfere, but the hesitation of a legion man in the face of a simple prisoner was something no one expected to see. Marco tried to take a deep breath, gather the courage he always had. But every time he tried to force his body to move forward, he felt that gaze penetrate even deeper into his soul. A memory came to his mind, without warning. A cold day, many years ago, when I was still just a boy in Rome. His father, a stern blacksmith, holding his small hands and placing a dagger in them. "The world belongs to the strong," he had said. "Never hesitate, never waver. Weakness is the same as death." Marco heard those words echoing in his mind, but now they seemed empty, because Jesus was there, because he said nothing, but at the same time he said everything. The sword slipped slightly from his hand. Marco tried to steady her again, but his fingers no longer had the same strength. He blinked, confused. How was it possible that a simple look had more power than any order he had ever received? How was it possible that, in a single instant, all his certainty about the world had begun to crumble? Jesus finally stepped forward. It wasn't an abrupt movement. It wasn't a threatening gesture. It was just one step, but to Marco it felt like an earthquake. The shadow of Jesus fell over Ephraim, still kneeling on the ground. The condemned man, who moments before seemed to accept his death, now looked at Jesus with eyes full of hope. And then Jesus spoke again. "You have power over life and death, but what do you choose, Marco?" The voice was not loud, but it resounded like thunder inside the soldier's chest. He hadn't said his name. None of the soldiers had said his name, but Jesus knew. Marco felt a shiver run down his spine. His heart raced even more. He tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe someone in the crowd had mentioned his name before. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. He was being called. Something inside him broke. He felt, at that exact moment, that he was no longer the same man, that something inside him had already changed, even if he didn't yet know how or why. Sweat ran down his face, his eyes fixed on Jesus. And that's when he realized Jesus was not there just to save Ephraim. Jesus was there to save him. Have you ever felt like someone came into your life at the right time? Like they knew exactly what you needed? Have you ever had the feeling that something bigger was calling you even without explanation? Right here in the comments, I want to know your experience. Now share this video with that person who also needs to know unknown stories about Jesus. The sword was still suspended in the air. The metal reflected the scorching sunlight, but instead of feeling like an extension of Marco's arm, it was now an unbearable weight. His hands were shaking, sweat was running down his face, and his breathing was heavy, almost uneven. Everything around him seemed to fall apart, as if the world he knew was dissolving before his eyes. The voices of the crowd were just distant murmurs, drowned out by the only sound that echoed within him: Jesus' words. "You have power over life and death. But what do you choose, Marco?" He heard his own name come out of Jesus' mouth. It wasn't possible. None of those present had called him that. To everyone there, he was just a Roman centurion, another soldier carrying out orders, an instrument of Rome's brutal machine. But Jesus knew who he was. I knew his name. He knew something deeper, something Marco couldn't explain. His heart raced even more. For years, he obeyed without question. His purpose was to follow orders. He had been trained not to feel, not to hesitate, to be a blade in the service of the empire. But now, for the first time, his mind screamed against what his body had always known how to do. The weight of the decision crushed him. Jesus' eyes remained fixed on him. There was no requirement, there was no threat, just a silent invitation. The crowd began to notice Marco's hesitation. The murmurs grew louder. Men and women whispered among themselves, exchanging looks of confusion and disbelief. They had never seen anything like this. A Roman soldier hesitating in the face of execution. This was unheard of. The other soldiers also noticed. Some were restless, fidgeting with the hilts of their swords, exchanging glances with each other, waiting to see what would happen. Among them, only one man did not expect it: the commander. "Comply with the order, centurion!" The voice cut through the silence like a sharp blade. The Roman commander took a few steps forward, his face red with fury. His eyes were hard, merciless. He wouldn't admit a failure like that in his troop. Marco was startled. His mind snapped back to reality. He blinked a few times as if waking up from a trance. The sword was still high. Ephraim's gaze was on him. Jesus' gaze still burned his soul. The commander gritted his teeth and took another step forward. "Centurion, do what Rome orders." The crowd became tense. Some cowered, waiting for the inevitable. The surrounding soldiers seemed ready to intervene if necessary. Marco felt a shiver run down his spine. I had never disobeyed. He had never hesitated. But at that moment, a certainty grew within him, taking space where before there was only blind obedience. He couldn't kill that man. His fingers began to loosen on the hilt of the sword. His mind was still screaming, trying to remind him of the consequences of his choice. He knew what would happen if he didn't obey. He knew that challenging Rome was not an option, but at the same time, he knew that if he struck that blow, something inside him would die forever. Jesus remained motionless, just waiting. He didn't beg, he didn't argue, just looked. Marco felt a lump in his throat. The sword began to descend, but not in a scam. His arm gave way slowly until the edge of the blade was no longer on Ephraim. He lowered the sword completely. The metal touched the ground with a sound that seemed to resonate like thunder within it. The crowd gasped. The murmurs grew louder. Some people's eyes widened. Others put their hands to their mouths in shock. The commander was frozen for a second. Afterwards, his face contorted in fury. "What do you think you are doing?" Marco didn't respond right away. Their eyes were fixed on Jesus. Then he did something he never thought he would do. He dropped the sword. Metal fell onto the dust of the road, a dry, final sound. The crowd exploded into screams. Some applauded, others shouted indignantly. The soldiers tensed, some already drawing their weapons, waiting for the order to act. The commander took 2 steps forward, pointing his finger directly in Marco's face. "You just signed your sentence, Centurion." Marco didn't respond. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He didn't know what would happen now, but I knew I could never go back. Jesus was still there. His look was the same, and for the first time, Marco felt like he was truly free. Stop for a second and answer. Have you ever made a decision that completely changed your life? Have you ever felt like a single moment could define everything? Right here in the comments, what was that moment? I really want to know your story, because maybe it can inspire someone who is going through the same situation. Now, I'm sure this story is moving you, so do yourself a favor. Leave a like. Do you know why? Because when you do that, YouTube understands that this message needs to reach more people. And it might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. And there's more. Subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next will move you even more. And I guarantee you won't want to miss it. The impact of the sword falling to the ground still echoed in Marco's mind, as if that sound had marked the end of an era in his life. His fingers trembled slightly, feeling the strange absence of the weight of the steel that for so many years had been an extension of his own body. He was breathing quickly. His heart was still racing, but at the same time, something inside him was beginning to calm down. It was as if a storm was finally dissipating, leaving behind a deafening silence. The surrounding crowd was still murmuring, trying to process what had just happened. Some were outraged, others fascinated, but all felt they had witnessed something they would never forget. Roman soldiers did not hesitate. Roman soldiers did not disobey, but there was Marco standing still, without a sword in his hands, facing the furious gaze of his commander, facing the gaze of his fellow legions, and facing himself. But most of all, he still faced Jesus' gaze, and it was at that moment that he understood. All his life, Marco believed that strength meant power, that obedience meant honor, that following orders meant doing your duty. But now, faced with that serene gaze that seemed to see even the darkest corners of his soul, he realized that true strength did not lie in wielding a blade. I was choosing when to lower it, and it wasn't just him. How often do people live trapped by invisible orders? How many times do we follow standards, rules, expectations imposed by a world that tells us what to do, what to think, how to act? How many times do we believe we are in control, when, in reality, we are just carried along by the current of customs that we never question? Marco always thought his life was already mapped out, that his destiny was to be a soldier, a warrior, someone who existed only to serve Rome, to carry out orders without hesitation. But at that moment, he realized that destiny is not a fixed road. It can be changed in an instant, by a choice. And how many times have we met exactly like this, standing still in front of a decision that could change everything, looking at a path we've always walked, but feeling like something is wrong, that there's something bigger calling us. And in the midst of this doubt, that voice appears. It is not always an audible voice. Sometimes it's a feeling, an intuition, a tightness in the chest, a look, something that tells us that we cannot continue on the path we are on, something that makes us hesitate before acting, before following what already seemed to be decided. Many people spend their entire lives ignoring this voice, pretending that they didn't feel anything, that it was just a moment of weakness, an instant of doubt that must soon be discarded. But what if that voice is the only thing that can save us? How many times are we about to make a mistake and something stops us? How many times does a word, a look, a simple silence cause a decision to be rethought? Marco saw his entire life change because for a single moment he stopped to listen, because for the first time he allowed something bigger to speak louder than the voices he always obeyed. And this story is not just about him, she's about all of us. And now tell me, have you ever felt like you were about to make a bad decision and something stopped you? Have you ever heard that voice, that feeling that stopped you from following a path that, deep down, wasn't the right one? Right here in the comments, I really want to know your story. If this narrative touched your heart, leave a like, because more people need to hear this. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time, because what comes next will be even more surprising. If this story touched you, perhaps it is a sign that Jesus still speaks to you today. Maybe this isn't just a story about a soldier and a choice, but about you, about something that God wants to show you right now. If you felt this voice, if at any point in this video something moved you in a different way, already subscribe to the channel. Here, each story brings a deep meaning, and I'm sure the next ones that come along will speak to you even more. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment when you felt God speaking to you, something that made you stop and realize you needed to choose a different path? Tell me here in the comments. If you made it to the end comment, Jesus still speaks to me, because I really want to see who lived this experience with me. And of course, if this video made sense to you, already leave your like. This helps more people have access to stories like this, stories that can transform lives. And don't leave here now. The next video is already appearing on your screen, and I guarantee you, this story impacted you. The next one will surprise you even more. Click there and stay with me on this journey. The hidden stories of Jesus.